Hello, welcome again with our topic in CC2, and this time this is the second part of the lecture for week 8, gas exchange. So balikan natin yung importance of oxygen in our body. So primarily, oxygen is the basic energy source of all organs. And kung maalala nyo, no, the part of respiration, the major part of respiration is depends on the level of oxygen acquired by our lungs. So we have two types of respiration. We have aerobic and anaerobic. Aerobic, ibig sabihin, the respiration requires oxygen. Anaerobic naman, no requirement of oxygen. Dahil ito sa absence of mitochondria. And these structures that makes use of anaerobic respiration are your red blood cells through this pathway, Embden-Meyerhof pathway. Kung maalala nyo, di ba, anaerobic glycolysis ang ating Embden-Meyerhof pathway, and it makes the majority of the energy source for the red blood cells. So we now enumerate the 7 requirements for adequate oxygenation. So first, available atmospheric oxygen. So ano ba yung mga types of environment na mababa ang oxygen level sa atmosphere? So ay, halimbawa, yung mga high altitude places like Baguio or ang tawag dito, mga mountainous area. So sa mga high altitude places, mababa ang oxygen level sa environment niyan. Next, adequate ventilation. Okay? So, dapat meron tayong ongoing exchange of the carbon dioxide and oxygen. Next naman, gas exchange between lungs and arterial blood, which happens in the alveoli. Diba? The functional unit of your lungs are your alveoli. And next, loading of oxygen onto the hemoglobin. So, dapat maganda yung affinity of your hemoglobin for your oxygen. So, wala dapat problem dun sa ating receptors or levels of your DPG, yung mga yan, which affects the affinity for oxygen. And pag-usapan naman natin yung hemoglobin, dapat okay din yung levels of your hemoglobin. Kasi ito yung carrier or the transport protein for the oxygen. Number 6, ang magdadala ng ating blood from the oxygenated blood from the lungs going to the target organ is the heart itself. So, kailangan maganda ang cardiac output. No? Siya yung magpo-push ng blood from the lungs going to the target organs. And lastly, dapat okay din yung target organ or the tissue itself. If may problem dun sa ating tissue, hindi madidislodge or hindi madideposit yung dalang oxygen ng hemoglobin. So, therefore, mababa ang oxygen levels ng mga problematic organs natin. And these are the factors that influence the movement of the oxygen, primarily dun sa ating lungs. So, ano mga factors yan? Number 1, destruction of alveoli. And alveoli, again, is the site for gas exchange. Okay. Next naman, number 2, your pulmonary edema. Edema is the abnormal accumulation of liquid or fluid. So, dapat meron lang tayong certain amount or scant amount of liquid inside the lungs. Kapag madaming masyadong liquid sa loob ng lungs, halimbawa ito, no? Ito yung ating baga. Makukuha yung space na supposedly for the expansion of the um, the lung organ itself. Hindi makakapag-expand na maayos, ibig sabihin, less yung oxygen na ma-acquire natin from the environment. So, masama din na mayroon tayong edema. Next naman, airway blockage. So, common sense na lang ito. Kapag walang pumapasok na hangin due to the obstruction, mas mababa ang oxygen levels sa katawan natin. Next naman, inadequate blood supply. So, okay ang lungs, pero halimbawa, no, nasagasaan ka, nakalahati yung katawan mo. So, therefore, konti lang yung blood na pumupunta dun sa lungs to be oxygenated and to be transported back to the organs. And then lastly, the diffusion of your oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, dapat walang disturbance. Okay? Ang only exchange for your carbon dioxide is oxygen. So, kung may abnormal hemoglobins that carries proteins or compounds other than your oxygen, walang diffusion na mangyayari. Okay, another important to take note that each adult hemoglobin, what is adult hemoglobin nga ulit? This is HbA1, which consists your alpha and beta globin chain. They have or they must have the amount of 4 molecules of oxygen. Kasi bawat globin chain carries a molecule of oxygen. So we have 4 globin chains, so dapat 4 din yung oxygen molecules. Okay, we have 4 types of normal hemoglobin sa katawan natin. Okay? The majority of hemoglobin is in this form, oxyhemoglobin, which carries oxygen. Deoxyhemoglobin, or ganito siya sinusulat, HHGB or HHB, ito naman walang oxygen na nakadikit. But dahil walang oxygen na nakadikit, it is a free form hemoglobin, capable of binding oxygen or another compound. Next compound is carboxyhemoglobin, which contains your carbon monoxide. And ang problem natin dito, once na nakabound ang hemoglobin with carbon monoxide, it has an affinity of 200 times more than the oxygen. Sa ibang book, nakasulat 210 or 211, 204. So, basically, magkakaparehas lang naman yung values. So, yun i-consider natin as answer, no? 200 to 210. And the usual color of your blood or plasma is in cherry red color. And lastly, your methemoglobin. Methemoglobin naman, instead na nasa ferrous form, naka-ferric form ang iron natin, which is dapat ferrous. Bakit dapat ferrous? Kasi ang ferrous form has the ability to bind oxygen. Kapag naka-ferric siya, mababa ang affinity niya sa oxygen, therefore, walang dala or magkakaroon ng hypoxemia sa katawan ng tao dahil hindi nakakapag-transport ng oxygen. Itong type of hemoglobin. And the plasma, yung color ng plasma natin is in chocolate brown. Next naman, balikan natin the relationship between the hemoglobin and oxygen. So, tingnan natin yung mga terminologies natin. Affinity means the binding of the oxygen and hemoglobin. Kabaligtaran niya is dissociation. Ibig sabihin yan, the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. And this affinity and dissociation will depend on the levels of your 2,3-DPG or diphosphoglycerate. And this is part of your hemoglobin which dictates if kaya niya i-release niya yung oxygen or hindi. Okay? And this 2,3-DPG binds more on the beta globin chain rather than the alpha globin chain. So therefore, itong binding na to will release the oxygen. Ay tandaan nyo, kapag nag-bind si 2,3-DPG with the beta globin chain, ma-release na si oxygen from the hemoglobin. Okay, based on this diagram, no, ito yung ating oxyhemoglobin. Once na nag-bind si 2,3-DPG sa beta globin chain, maalis si oxygen, which is yung kulay green nating compound, no, dito sa diagram na to. Okay, and this is now what we call the dissociation. And pupunta ngayon ng oxygen dun sa ating mga target organs. Okay, next, we will discuss the amount of oxygen in hemoglobin. And this all depends on the following situation. Number 1, the availability of oxygen. So, kung mababa naman ang oxygen mo sa environment, for sure mababa din yung daladalang oxygen ng hemoglobin mo. Next, the concentration and the type of hemoglobin. The adult hemoglobin is the most efficient carrier of the oxygen. So, kapag meron kang halimbawa carboxyhemoglobin or methemoglobin which has a lesser affinity with your oxygen, lesser din ang oxygen levels mo sa target tissues mo. Next, the interfering substances such as your carbon monoxide na discuss nga natin kanina, no? It has a 200 times more affinity than oxygen, or in other books, 210 times more affinity. Next is blood pH would matter in the amount of oxygen in the hemoglobin. So, paano yan nagmamatter? Okay? So, sabi nga natin, no, pH is directly proportional to your affinity and indirectly proportional with dissociation. So, tingnan natin mabuti. Kung acidotic ka, so ang pH mo is supposedly low. Directly proportional with affinity. So, low ang affinity, more dissociation. So, mas lumalabas ngayon si oxygen from the RBC. Okay, other way around naman, alkalosis, high pH. So, directly proportional with affinity. So, high affinity, less dissociation. Mas dikit ngayon si oxygen dun sa ating hemoglobin. Next naman, temperature. Pagsamasamahin ko na, temperature, PCO2, and 2,3-DPG. These are all indirectly proportional naman with the affinity and directly proportional sa dissociation or release. So, halimbawa dito, high temperature, PCO2 and 2,3-DPG. So, indirectly proportional sa affinity. Pag high ito, magiging low affinity, more dissociation, so therefore more release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Okay, dito naman sa example na to, low temp, low PCO2, low 2,3-DPG, ibig sabihin high affinity, less release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Okay, dito na tayo sa curve, no? Meron tayong tinatawag na shift to the left and shift to the right. Ang shift to the left means mas dikit si oxygen sa hemoglobin. Ang shift to the right, mas nag-release ng oxygen ang hemoglobin. Okay? Ang affinity ba ng oxygen to the hemoglobin when increased, is it a bad news or a good news? In some aspect, it is a bad news. Okay? Kasi ang primary function naman ng hemoglobin is to transfer your oxygen from the hemoglobin to the tissues na kailangan din ng organ natin. Okay? So, kailangan balance din ang affinity and release. So, ang normal na curve is supposedly nasa gitna, which is yung curve B. Okay? So, in what instances ng katawan or mga condition na nagpapa-shift to the left and shift to the right of the hemoglobin-oxygen curve? Okay. Balikan natin. Ang shift to the left means increase ang affinity of your oxygen and your hemoglobin. And increase din ang pH. All other factors ngayon are decreased, such as your hydrogen, carbon dioxide, temperature, altitude, and 2,3 dpg. And in what instances pa? Meron kang mga dyshemoglobin or mga abnormal hemoglobin such as your carboxyhemoglobin, methemoglobin, and fetal hemoglobin. Dito, no, mas increase ang affinity ng oxygen sa hemoglobin. Okay? As in contrast with shift to the right, no, there's a decreased affinity, mas nag-release. And in what instances? Kapag decrease ang blood pH and kapag ang other factors are increased naman, no, opposite dun sa kabila. Meron pa, may mga instances na may anemia ka such as thalassemia or IDA, iron deficiency anemia, nagkakaroon ng shift to the right. Okay? So, tatandaan lang natin, no, left shift, increase affinity, increase pH, all decrease. Right shift, decrease affinity, decrease pH, lahat increase. Tandaan natin yung mnemonics na LIRD. Left increase, right decrease. Okay, Haldane versus Bohr effect naman tayo. Nababasa nyo yan in CC, sometimes in HEMA. So, discuss natin. Haldane effect, it talks about affinity of oxygen to your hemoglobin, releasing the carbon dioxide. No? Gaano kadikit si oxygen dun sa hemoglobin. And this Haldane effect causes shift to the left on the hemoglobin-oxygen curve. Okay? So, tanda lang natin itong mga mnemonics, no? Haldane. Hemoglobin affinity to the oxygen causes release of carbon dioxide. And therefore, shift to the left. Sa Bohr effect naman, ang pinag-uusapan natin dito, no, the increase of carbon dioxide will release oxygen from the hemoglobin. So shift to the right. Okay, dito tayo sa parang mnemonics natin. Yung O ng Bohr, oxygen release from hemoglobin, and shift to the right. Okay. So, in clinics, we can assess oxygen status of the patient using these 4 parameters. Okay. Unahin natin the oxygen saturation. So, ito ay yung SO2 or dun sa lecture natin kanina, pareha siya nung SaO2. So, ano ulit ang ating normal value for this? More than 95%. The next is the measured fractional oxyhemoglobin, FO2 hemoglobin yan. And nakikita lang yan during intubation, no, do sa ating mechanical ventilators. The next, oxygen saturation assessed by transcutaneous or pulse oximetry. So again, no, more than 95% din yan. So parehas lang sila. Pero ang difference niyan is ito, nakukuha to in ABG or arterial blood gas. Ito naman by spectrophotometry. Papakita ko sa inyo, no, kung ano ang difference between these two. Ito, mas madali to, no, mas less invasive, pwede ito sa bedside. And lastly, the amount of oxygen dissolved in the plasma, o tinatawag natin PO2 or PaO2, arterial pressure of oxygen, and it is range from 80 to 100 millimeter mercury. Okay, let's proceed with the different types of gadgets that can measure these four parameters of oxygen. Unahin natin si pulse oximeter, which uses spectrophotometry as its principle. And in this machinery, you can detect both deoxyhemoglobin and oxyhemoglobin using infrared light. So, ito yung pulse oximeter. Makikita nyo to sa mga clinics or pwede siyang dalhin anywhere kasi battery operated ito. It can measure your SpO2 and at the same time the pulse rate, no, or beats per minute. And yung sinasabi kong infrared, ito yon, no? The more na ang na-absorb nitong ng infrared is the oxyhemoglobin. So, dalawang types lang yung kaya niyang i-detect, either the deoxy and the oxyhemoglobin. Ang next naman is co-oximeter, and again, spectrophotometry din to. The difference is that mas advanced ito because it can detect the four forms of hemoglobin, your oxyhemoglobin, deoxyhemoglobin, methemoglobin, and carboxyhemoglobin. So therefore, if ever kung kaya niyang makadetect ng apat na types of hemoglobin, mas kaya niyang makadetect ng cause of hypoxemia. Okay? Kaya niyang malaman kung ano na yung tumataas in each type of hemoglobin. And usually, makikita ito sa ICU, yung mga yan, and during OR, sa operation, ginagamit yan ng mga anesthesiologist. Next naman natin is the blood gas analyzers which make use of arterial blood. Okay? Hindi siya katulad ng mga pang-bedside gadgets natin. Hindi to kayang dalhin anywhere. So, sa laboratory to ginagamit. So, unahin natin, no? Yung ating blood gas analyzers can detect the following parameters. Your PO2, at the same time, your PCO2 and pH. The principle between these parameters are different. Your PO2 makes use of amperometry, PCO2 and pH uses potentiometry. So, recall lang natin back in CC1, ano ba ibig sabihin nitong dalawang ito? Amperometry is the change of current flow, and potentiometry is the change in voltage. So, ano ang ginagamit naman na machinery in measuring amperometry and potentiometry? Sa amperometry, we make use of microammeter, and the potentiometry naman, voltmeter ang gamit. So, therefore, your microammeter is for your PO2, voltmeter is for PCO2 and pH. And additionally, electrodes in each parameter are different. So, ito, must know yan. Lagyan nga natin ng star yan. Tinatanong din yan sa mga board exam review centers. The PO2 makes use of Clark electrode. PCO2 naman, Severing-House. And pH makes use of silver chloride or AgAgCl electrode. So, wala akong maisip ng mnemonics. Kayo nang bahala. Paano nyo yan tatandaan? So, pero ito ay isa sa mga tinuturo sa board exam review centers. Next naman, quality assurance. So, paano natin ma-assure, no, the quality, no, for the accuracy of our results. So, number one, bawal magkamali dahil napakasakit ng arterial blood collection. So, we have to properly identify the patient. How you will identify the patient? By asking for the patient's name. No? wag kayo halimbawa, no? Tatanungin nyo, ikaw ba si ABG Laos? So, hindi ganon. Ano pong pangalan ninyo? Dapat ganon ang approach. And then, double check your laboratory request. And, yon. So, dapat manggagaling sa pasyente mismo yung pangalan niya, no? Hindi sa nurse, hindi dun sa pangalan na nasa bed. Okay, maling-mali yon. Pero yun nga, ang sabi ko nga, masakit na masakit tong procedure na to. So make sure tamang pasyente ang gagawin, ang kukuhaan nyo ng dugo. Next naman, choice of site. So either radial, brachial, femoral, and hindi na to ginagawa, no? Temporal artery. So, nasaan yung mga points na yan? So, radial artery, yung beside the thumb. Okay? Brachial artery, malapit dun sa mid-cubital fossa, yung bandang kilikili side. No? And then, pwede ka sa axillary. Well, ito na yung mga less frequent. Axillary, temporal, femoral, yung mga yan. Dahil, very painful na, no? Dahil mas malalaki yung mga ugat ng mga yan. Lalo na dati, temporal artery pa. So, nasa malapit sa head, mas mahirap kuhain. Lalo na sa bata dahil magalaw sila. And then, halimbawa, no, mahirap din talaga dito sa ating upper extremity. Ayaw mo mag-femoral, ayaw mo mag-axillary, pwede ka dito sa baba. Okay? Unless diabetic ang pasyente, pag diabetic, bawal ang mga mag-collect sa paa dahil pangit ang blood flow ng mga diabetic patients na nasa lower extremities. Then number 3, heparin is the anticoagulant of choice. Okay? Ano ulit ang kulay ng heparin sa ating mga Vacutainer? It is green. No? Merong minsan light green or dark green. Any of that options, heparin pa rin ang laman ng mga yan. Next is, we have to ensure the speed of collection. So, kailangan you can make an adequate mixing once you collected the blood to make sure na walang clot formation. Dahil ang clot will form parang, kumbaga masisira yung blood gas analyzer once na na-aspirate niya yung clot na yon. And then next, avoidance of the oxygen spillage. So actually we make use of a special syringe with stopper. And minsan, kung wala kang stopper, you bend the needle. So, ito yung tinatawag kong stopper. It is actually plastic lang, no? Minsan, walang available sa hospital. Ang ginagawa namin, alam nyo ba yung rubber stopper ng mga Vacutainer? So, yun, pwede na yun. Yung mga patapon na Vacutainer, pinupulot pa namin yan. Which is bawal naman. So, kinukuha namin yung gray na stopper ng Vacutainer. Yun yung ginagamit namin as a stopper. Tapos minsan, kung wala kami mapulot na ganito, binibend na lang namin. No? To ensure that no oxygen can be spilled during the blood collection. So kung magtataka kayo, baka doktora, mabali yung needle, matusok pa ako. Ang mga needle ng mga syringes natin are so specialized that it can only bend, but and hindi siya talaga masisira or mabe-break into two. So, ganun ka-special yung ating mga needles ng mga syringes. So, other than the patient's name, you have to also consider the respiratory rate and the body temperature of the patient. So, paano magsusukat ng respiratory rate ba? Diba, ang sabi natin 12 to 20 cycles per minute. So, ang shortcut dyan, bibilangin mo yung paghinga ng patient, yung mga inhalation niya within 30 seconds and times 2 mo na lang. And then for body temperature, kailangan may dala ka na thermometer to check for the temperature. Ganyan ka-toxic ang arterial blood collection. Okay? So, bakit natin tinitake note tong mga to? So, So, unahin natin ang RR, di ba? Ang mas mataas na RR, ibig sabihin, mataas din ang ine-expect mo na blood pH. So, you counter-check with the condition of the patient. Sa body temperature naman, di ba? Mas mataas ang temperature, less affinity with the oxygen. So, titinan mo ngayon yung PO2 mo kung compatible with the body temperature of the patient. The amount of sample should be 1 to 3 ml only kasi hindi naman kailangan ng masyadong marami ng blood gas analyzers natin. And aside from that, so, syempre masakit na masakit to sa pasyente kaya konting-konting blood lang ang kailangan natin. Then next, itatakbo mo yan agad dun sa ating laboratory. Minsan hiwalay yung nag-a-analyze ng blood gas dun sa mismong laboratory natin, no? Kaya kailangan alam mo kung saan ka pupunta and alam mo kung gaano kakabilis tatakbo dahil it must be analyzed within 30 minutes lang. After that, questionable na yung resulta mo. And then next, placing the specimen in an ice water slurry is not recommended anymore. Dati, no, aside from the preparation, no, kailangan malaman yung pangalan ng patient, the RR, the temperature, and kukuha ka ng stopper para ma-avoid yung oxygen spillage, and kailangan na maghanap ng ice. Dati, lahat ng yon ginagawa namin. Ngayon, hindi na recommended. Dahil ang ice water slurry can actually cause a derangement in the oxygen levels. Pero the advantage of this ice water slurry is that it can minimize the metabolism of the RBC of the oxygen. Hindi niya mababawasan. Pero, na-discover na it can be a source of derangement dahil yung oxygen can diffuse through the pores of the plastic syringe once na na-disturb yung temperature. Okay? And then therefore, this increased oxygen solubility, no, will cause a shift to the left. Again, the shift to the left, ibig sabihin, more affinity with oxygen, mga yan. So, dati yan, naghahanap kami ng actually, baso, yan. Tapos maghanap kami ng ice para doon namin ilalagay yung specimen namin. Minsan wala kayong makitang ice, magkakayod kami ng parang mga nanigas na ice doon sa ref ng mga nurses. Di ba yung mga lagay nila ng gamot? Doon kumukuha kami. And it is a horror story for a medical student kapag kumukuha ng arterial blood. So, actually, nung face-to-face naman kami, hindi namin to ginawa dahil it is very painful. So, I always suggest to watch ABG videos, no, lalo na sa YouTube. And in internship, no, dinidiscourage kayong gawin ito, lalo na kung meron naman kayong choice na vein na pwede nyong i-venipuncture. Dahil nga, marami kasi siyang consequence such as bleeding, yung mga ganyan, and pain with the patient, minsan paralysis, manghihina yung part ng katawan ng pasyente, lalo doon sa site na kinuhaan nyo, kasi katabi nun is a nerve. So, madalas, no, magkakaroon ng slight paralysis yung pasyente. Pero once na na-memorize yun na yung wonders of ABG, hindi nyo na yan iiwan. I mean, nakaka-addict siyang gawin dahil no need for tourniquet, no need for kapa-kapa ng veins kasi mas madaling hanapin ang nagpapalpitate na artery than a vein. Trust me. For quality control naman, we have different approaches depende dun sa institution ninyo and dun sa blood gas analyzer machine ninyo. So first na i-discuss ko is the most traditional and most commonly used in the laboratory, which is the surrogate liquid control material. And in this type of quality control, yung mga control mo ay meron ng known levels of or concentration of the parameters. If kaya yan basahin at the same level or concentration ng blood gas analyzer machine na hawak mo, ibig sabihin, well-controlled pa din yung machine mo or very accurate pa rin ang machine mo. Kung malayo na yung nakukuhang result ng machine, kailangan na yan palitan. Next naman, tonometry. And in this case, meron tayong comparison with the known concentration and an unknown concentration. And depende yan with different parameters. Kung same sila ng value such as yung temperature, the pressure, and humidification. So, dapat parehas sila ng known control and the unknown unknown sample. Next naman is duplication. It is halimbawa, using the same sample, you duplicate it or you do it twice. Kapag iba yung result nung una and pangalawang try mo dun sa sample mo, ibig sabihin, meron tayong problema with the blood gas analyzer. And then lastly, the non-surrogate quality control method. And this is popular with the yung mga machineries natin na kung gusto mo lang ng quick quality control o madali ang quality control. And this time, gagamit ka lang ng mga devices to check kung okay or not yung ating blood gas analyzers. You don't need to use another controls or sample fluids at all. And that's the last slide of my lecture for week 8. Week 8 nga ba? Yes, week 8. And you will have a unit test next week. Ang topics will be the electrolytes by Prof. Abling, ABG, and gas exchange, kasama din dun sa next week na unit test. So, good luck and study well.